Hello, everyone. This is Dorie Clark, and you are here with our weekly Newsweek interview show, Better, where we interview authors, executives, entrepreneurs, and other fantastic people to talk about real-world strategies that can make your life better. Today, we're talking about women in leadership with the author of the new book, When Women Lead. Her name is Julia Boorstin. She's a CNBC reporter. Julia, it's great to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor.
Well, thank you. And for those of you who are tuning in live, please write into the chat box and let us know who you are and where you're dialing in from. We'd love to say hello to you and take your questions about women, leadership, and more with Julia. So, Julia, my first question, you set the stage. In your book, you talk about the fact that 8% of Fortune 500 CEOs are women, which sounds kind of lame, but actually is the best it's ever been.
It's an all-time high, if you could believe it. And what's been so interesting is that, I think that there's this perception of progress, right? That there's this perception like, oh, it's 2022, things have changed, but 8.5%, and that's an all-time high. So I think there's, it's really striking to me and important to talk about the fact that women are still not reaching those highest ranks of leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems to be the great puzzle because, as you also mentioned, back when you were growing up, your mom said to you, and lots of people's moms did, oh, don't worry. By the time you grow up, the pipeline will be settled and we'll be at equality. But clearly that has not happened. Is it just that it's moving slower than we imagined and we'll be at equality in another 150 years? Or, what's the problem? What's the holdup here?
The problem is that the pace of change is so glacial that if we're talking about 150 years before there's any sense of gender equity in the most powerful roles in business, that it means things are not moving fast enough. And also because it's so possible for there to be setbacks, say from things like the pandemic, that we need to have a different way that we think about leadership. We need to have a new conversation, because saying, oh, in 150 years, things are going to be different, that's not going to get us there. And I don't think that's going to serve the world well to have a leadership base that is predominantly white men. That's just not the right thing for the economy right now, especially in times of crisis. It is beneficial to everybody to have more women in leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. We're here with Julia Boorstin. She is a reporter for CNBC. She's also the author of a new book. It's called When Women Lead. You can learn more about her. Check out her work at juliaboorstin.com.
And I just pulled out my book. I was using it to prop up my laptop.
Yeah, we heard. That is fantastic. And thank you. That's great. The book is When Women Lead. And we want to say hi to some of the great folks tuning in around the world to join us. We've got Jeannie joining us from California. Patricia's in Boston. Cheryl is back again from Minneapolis, St. Paul. We have Zara from Chicago. Taylor is in France. Nancy's in Boston. Andrea is in Boston. Wow. Well done, Bay State. You're rocking it. We've got South Florida in the house. Karen's in the UK, and Alexandra is here from Johannesburg. We love having every single one of you, and type your questions for Julia Boorstin into the chat box. But first, Julia, I'm curious, one of the things that, of course, is important. I mean, women are a part of the equation. Men are obviously part of the equation. So if someone is tuning in and watching this and they are a male executive, a male entrepreneur, and they'd like to do something, they would like to be supportive of women in business, what are the recommendations that you have for men so that they can be allies in this process?
Well, I would actually say that men need to think about this less about being kind to your coworkers and being an ally, and more about how they will benefit financially if they invest in more women. That men benefit, the whole ecosystem benefits when more women are running companies. And there's so much research about this. I have so much data in my book, whether it's women in the C-suite, women at the top in CEO roles, women on boards, women running VC funds, the amount of women who are in VC funds, or women running startups. When you have more women and people of color, that correlates with higher performance. So I think we need to shift the conversation around DEI from like, this is the right thing to do ethically, to this is the smart thing to do financially. So I think men need to understand that. And there's plenty of data in my book that lays that out. But I also think that men need to understand that this is this moment as we emerge from the pandemic, as we try to navigate not only a lot of challenges around the economy, such as inflation, but also new workplace environments. This is a moment for everyone to think about what it means to be a new leader in a new way. in the book, I outline how women tend to lead in different ways than men tend to lead, and that the ways that women tend to lead are actually found to be incredibly successful. And those traits and strategies are incredibly successful for women, but they are also effective if they're adopted by men. So I could talk about some of those skills and strategies, but I would argue that everyone needs to break free from this archetype of what leaders look like, how they behave, and understand that people need to lead in ways that are authentic to them, and those traits and those ways, even though they haven't traditionally been valued in business and in leadership over the past many decades, those are actually the secrets to success right now.
That's a great point. We're here with Julia Boorstin. You can learn more about her book. It's When Women Lead, and it's juliaboorstin.com. You can learn about her and check out all the details there. So, Julia, a great question came in from Cynthia in Los Angeles, and she wants to know, can you share some tips about how that she and others like her can be their own best personal advocates? She says, I can dwell on a mistake for days rather than focus on a positive outcome, even when I know better. For people who are facing that situation, especially women, what would you recommend?
This is really interesting. And I think this is a really important thing to understand. Everyone is going to fail. Everyone is going to face challenging situations and then their own personal mistakes. There's fascinating data about how people who are athletes, especially women who are athletes, tend to be more successful in business. And I was fascinated by this research. I really wanted to understand the why of it. I was not an athlete in high school or college, and I can't get into a time machine. So I wanted to figure out, what was it about that athletic experience that enabled women in particular to be more successful in business? And it turns out it really does come back to frequency of failure. If you're playing a sport, you're going to lose half the games on average, right? You're going to lose a lot, no matter how good you are. And what these researchers have found, and there are some fascinating studies about this that I write about in the book, is that if you do athletics, you do something called after event reviews. They don't maybe technically call that, but that's what researchers call it. After event review is the idea of, after a game, you go back and you review the tape. You have to get used to failing, but you also have to understand how to learn from your mistakes. After every game, after every experience where you feel like you made a mistake, it's important to go back and systematically review what happened. What did you do that was good? What do you want to make sure that you continue to do well and improve upon next time? So identifying your successes. Then, what did you do that was wrong, that was your own fault? You made a mistake, but take the time to learn from it, to say, okay, this is a learning experience. I'll never make that mistake again. I always say that to myself, like, well, that's a mistake I'll only make once. But then it's also really important to identify the things that went wrong that were out of your control. Why did that happen? Yes, it was out of your control, but understanding that that was something that you don't need to take personally because it was out of your control. And how can you better navigate a situation like that, which may be horrible and totally out of your control, but you may face it again next time. So I think dividing up the experiences, failure is normal, get used to it. And the better you are at reviewing the tape and doing those after event reviews, the better you will be at learning from your mistakes and bouncing back quickly. We're all going to fail. The people who are successful over the long run are the ones that can bounce back quickly.
Excellent point. If you're enjoying this conversation, hit the button and hit the share button so that your friends and colleagues can benefit from it as well. We're here with Julia Boorstin. Her new book is When Women Lead. And feel free, if you're just joining us, type into the chat box and let us know who you are and where you are dialing in from. We want to say hi to our amazing friends like Deepika, who's joining from India. We've got Cindy in Savannah. Gail is in Madrid. She says, hola. Youngchen is in Bangalore. Bree is in Knoxville. Becky's north of Boston. Rachel is in Lexington. Amy is from Boston. Oh my goodness.
A lot of Northeasterners, a lot of Massachusetts in there.
Absolutely. Massachusetts is in the house today. Jennifer's in New York City. Teresa is in Louisville, and Sania is in Washington. We're glad to have all of you here. Now, Julia, you mentioned earlier, you were alluding to this, that, women seem to have some differences, writ large. Obviously, the biggest differences are individual differences. But if we look at it at the population level, what have you seen in female leaders that might be slightly different from what male leaders in the aggregate do? And what's the impact of that?
Yeah. And what I would say is that all of this research that I found is not about biology. These are about traits that are socialized and taught and learned. And some of these traits are socialized from the time kids are in preschool. And what happens as a result of that is women tend to lead in ways that are different from the way that men tend to lead. So for instance, women are more likely to lead with empathy. There are a lot of tests that have found that women actually rate higher on empathy tests. And I actually have one of these empathy tests on my website. You can grade your own empathy. It's a really fun one. And basically, these researchers have found that you can see that women are more statistically better at deploying empathy. But this is incredibly valuable for business because empathy is important to connect with your investors, to connect with your customers, to connect with your employees. But this is a trait that has not traditionally been valued by male leaders. Increasingly, I do think that's starting to change, which is why I hope that men will see the value in studying some of these successful women I write about in my book. Another key one is vulnerability. Vulnerability has often been associated with weakness in business. But in fact, vulnerability about what you don't know is essential to invite collaboration. And as oftentimes I found in dozens of interviews, been essential to hire senior executives to come work with you. So vulnerability is a key one. Women are more comfortable, as these studies have found, are more comfortable showing vulnerability in the workplace. But again, this is a strategy that men should be adopting as well. Another really surprising one is gratitude. A lot of research has found that women are more likely to practice gratitude and enjoy the feeling of gratitude more than men do. That ties into the sense of men wondering, oh, maybe if I feel grateful, then maybe I owe someone something. Is there a sense of sort of being in someone's debt if you feel grateful? Women enjoy the feeling of gratitude, and gratitude is correlated with long-term planning and bigger picture problem solving, which is amazing and obviously incredibly valuable if you want to succeed in the workplace. We always want to be thinking big picture, not as anxious about the near-term wins and playing for the long game. So those are a couple of them. But I think from a strategic standpoint, really important to note that women are more likely to lead in a communal way, bringing in perspectives from across their organization rather than a top-down approach, the guy in the corner office making the decisions. Another key one is women are more likely to think in a divergent way, meaning pulling in perspective, like pulling on threads, asking questions to figure out what the sort of forest is, to understand the forest around the tree that is a particular problem, where men are more likely to be convergent. So rushing to drive for a solution to address the particular tree in the forest, whereas women are trying to build a greater understanding of the forest itself. Now, I think this ties into why women tend to rate higher in adaptability. If you understand the forest, if you have a bigger picture perspective of what's happening around your business challenges, that when the situation shifts, you've already explored those other roads. So you may have a better perspective about what's going on and be able to adapt more quickly. So all of these are amazing strategies that women are more likely to deploy. And I would argue that women need to understand that these are strengths and need to break free from the stereotypes and archetypes and thinking that maybe they don't match what leaders look like, and understand that they have those superpowers, those leadership superpowers within them. And I think men need to study these female leaders and understand how they can break free from those archetypes as well.
Really excellent point. We're here with Julia Boorstin. I'm Dorie Clark. This is our weekly Newsweek interview show, Better. And Julia is the author of the new book, When Women Lead. If you want to make sure that you never miss one of our weekly interview shows, which is Thursday, every noon Eastern, 9 Pacific, 5 o'clock in London. Actually, no, that's a lie. It's 4 o'clock in London now. Time change. You can go to DorieClark.com, sign up, join the list, download a free self-assessment. You'll get reminders. And if you want to learn more about Julia, check out her website. It's juliaboorstin.com. Now, a great question came in, Julia, from Anna, who wants to talk about the likability conundrum. She says, women leaders are judged by their style oftentimes, not their substance. How can we survive the likability conundrum and flourish with our personal brands? What do you think?
This is such a great question, and it shows that you know the research. I really believe knowledge is power. Knowing the double standards that you're going to face helps you navigate them. I write in the book about a study that was actually published by Fortune magazine about how women are far more likely to be judged on their style rather than their substance, which is a double loss, because not only are you being judged on something that has very little to do with your actual workplace performance, but if you're judged on your style, you're not getting valuable feedback about your performance. So back to what I said about failures, like you want to learn what you're doing wrong and what you could do better so you can improve. So this likability conundrum is huge. It also plays into all these double standards about how women are expected to display warmth, in addition to displaying some of the other characteristics that are necessary to succeed in business. So I go through a lot of this research in my book, but I think sometimes understanding the likability conundrum can help you manage it better. I don't think people should have to contort themselves into a pretzel to meet all the ways that they're expected to behave. But I do think that if you know this person is judging me more harshly because I'm not demonstrating warmth in that situation, then that is an incredibly powerful thing. I talked to this woman, I quote in my book, her name is Aya Badir, and she's the founder of a company called Little Bits. She's a Lebanese immigrant, and she has described to me the various varieties of bias she has faced for so many different reasons, for being an immigrant, for being a Muslim, for being a woman, she's an engineer, and people couldn't possibly believe that she was the engineer behind her company. So when she described to me all of these different double standards and biases, I was like, gosh, how did you keep on going? Why didn't you give up? Like, I think I would have given up. That's what you're describing is horrifying. And what she said to me was this: I can understand where the bias is. When I get feedback and it's purely the result of bias, then I can take that feedback and say, okay, this comment here, this is just bias. This is just feedback on my style or what I'm wearing or the fact that I'm a Lebanese woman, and has nothing to do with my product. And I could take that information, put it to the side, and then I could better interact with the content that's actually valuable that I'm getting. She described it with the analogy of remembering to wear a jacket when it's cold out. If you know you're going to be facing bias, if you know it's going to be cold out, you bring your jacket. And you might notice the cold, but you're not going to be incredibly uncomfortable. And this idea that you can arm yourself with knowledge of that data, with knowledge of all this research, and that's why I include it in my book, not to get you down, but to empower you to say, okay, wait a second, this comment about my style, that is bias. I'm going to push for feedback on my performance in as direct a way as I can. Maybe I'll flag the fact that that comment might have been a little inappropriate about my style. And I will not be bothered by the bias. And as a result of not being bothered by it, I can actually make the most out of the valuable feedback here. So I talk about this a little bit in my own experience with this, and how I got some feedback from a very senior man who was a communications executive. He told me that the interview I'd done with a CEO seemed very harsh to him. My tone seemed really mean. And first, I had a moment of being horrified. I was like, wait a second, mean? Like, I'm not mean. And then I realized that he was not reacting to the content of my interview at all. And he was judging me on my style and the fact that I didn't seem likable or nurturing in that interview. I was doing my job, and I was doing a good job at my job. But instead of spiraling and going back and rewatching the tape and wondering if I'd done something wrong, I said to him, gee, would you have given the same feedback to one of my male colleagues? And it totally caught him off guard. And he said, you know what, I have to think about it. I don't know. And so I think it's really important to just surround yourself with as much data with that jacket so you know what you're dealing with. And then you'll be able to make those decisions. Maybe in some situations, the stakes are high and you're going to be very careful of your tone so you're not accused of being mean. I've been cautious of that before, but I think that you can make those decisions once you have all the data laid out in front of you, which is a lot of that's in the second to last chapter in this book.
Fantastic. The book is When Women Lead. We're here with Julia Boorstin. This is our weekly Newsweek interview show, Better. And I'm Dorie Clark. We want to say hi to some of the great friends tuning in from around the world. We've got Regina, who's joining from Nigeria. Candace is in Canada. We have Patricia joining from Stockton, California. We've got Celeste back from South Africa. Mohammed Jahangir is here from Pakistan. Colleen's in Pittsburgh. We've got Mario here. Nelia is in Calgary. We have Gabrielle, who's here from Mexico, and Tandeka from Johannesburg, and Sachin's in India. We love having all of you here. Thank you for joining us. And a great question came in, and this is one that probably a lot of people have struggled with. Julia, Lori wants to know, can you give some recommendations about how to accept praise or recognition in a productive way rather than feeling the impulse to downplay your accomplishments?
Don't
what are your
downplay.
suggestions?
Just say thank you. Thank you. I worked really hard. I think sometimes the simplest answer is the best one. There's a lot of research about imposter syndrome, a lot of research about how women underestimate their performance compared to the way men rate their performance. And I think that if you can identify that you're doing that, you're downplaying, just cut it short. You don't need to talk for 5 sentences. Just say thank you. There's a study that I want to flag that ties into this, where male and female employees, thousands and thousands of employees, were asked to rate their male and female bosses. And this was a pretty broad study. And the employees, both men and women, rated the female bosses as performing better than the female bosses rated themselves. they rated the male bosses as performing less well than the male bosses rated themselves. So the men were rating their performance as better than they actually were doing if you count their performance as what the employees think of them. So I think that women do have a tendency to underestimate their own accomplishments and potential. So just say, thank you, I worked really hard, and leave it right there.
So good. Nice and easy. We can all adopt that. And another question came in, Julia, from Andrea, and she wants to know about mentoring. Do you have suggestions about implementing mentoring? And also, if you're the mentor, how do you do it? And also, how do you find a great mentor? What are your thoughts about that and the importance of that?
Well, one thing it's interesting I've heard a lot about since I've been on my book tour talking to people about my book is a lot of women, younger women, have said to me, it's really hard to find a woman to mentor me. There aren't that many in my organization. And my answer is find a man to mentor you. Women who want to succeed do not need to. And by the way, no one should just be mentored by people who are very similar to them. It's important for all the people at the top to be mentoring everyone, even the people who look nothing like them and have very little in common with them. And sometimes the most valuable mentorship relationships are those that come between people who are very, very different from each other, because then they can both learn from each other and gain from each other's perspectives. So I think it's important for people to break free from this idea that, oh, well, I could only be mentored by a white woman because that's who I am. But that's not true. My most valuable mentor was a man, and he changed my career. And I think we really need to encourage men to mentor young women, period. I've also seen some very valuable mentorship relationships with women mentoring men, because those men start to adopt some of those female leadership traits because they see how effective they've been for their bosses. I think from a very strategic standpoint, I think it's important to see who you might learn from as to be your mentor, and also what you could bring to them. And sometimes just something as simple as saying, hey, I'd love to hear your perspective on such and such question or this industry, and tell you a little bit about what I'm seeing in my job. Can I buy you a coffee? Can we go get a coffee? And even just saying, like, can we have 30 minutes to chat? Then you could get to know someone and see if you can learn from them, and if they're open to maybe also learning from you. Because I do think mentorship relationships work both ways. And I can't tell you how many senior executives have told me that they have learned so much from their mentors. From their mentees. So I think that think widely, cast your net widely, and also beyond your own company. Sometimes the most valuable mentorship relationships come from people who are in adjacent companies or even in different fields, but still telling you advice on how to navigate succeeding in the workplace.
Excellent point. We're here with Julia Boorstin. The book is When Women Lead. We want to say hi to Lauren, who's tuning in from Miami. We've got Magdalena from Poland. We have Rosinda in Madrid. Brenda's in Nova Scotia. Inez is in Croatia. And Cheryl is in North Carolina. We love having all of you. And hit the like and share button so your friends and colleagues can benefit from this interview with Julia as well. And Julia, a great question came in from Cheryl. And she wants to know, there's been a lot of talk about unconscious bias and the negative consequences of it. If you believe that this happens, how do you advise companies to help raise the awareness about what might be unconscious bias in the workplace?
Yeah, I mean, this is a complex problem that needs a very complex solution. And I increasingly have found data, and I increasingly believe that if companies pursue data, go on numbers-based solutions, they will be able to eliminate bias. And I believe that there are a number of tech tools that are available now that didn't exist 10 years ago or even 5 years ago that can help companies remove bias. One of these key issues is around equal pay. Another is around equal promotion, because there's been a lot of research finding that some of the pay gaps are not coming at the same level, but because men are getting promoted faster, particularly white men are getting promoted the fastest. Companies can adopt tech tools not only to address those issues, but also bias in hiring. There are some companies that I write about in this book. One is called Pymetrics, that uses what effectively feels like a computer game to test people's soft skills, to see what they might be good at doing or what they might be able to learn, as opposed to relying on the resume, which is an incredibly outdated way and can be totally a minefield of bias in terms of how people get hired, right? So a resume is a retroactive look at what kind of experiences oftentimes their parents could afford to pay for. And increasingly, we need to be using data to figure out what are the skills someone has, the soft skills someone has that can enable them to be successful in the future. And so I think that's part of it. But I think that one thing I find interesting and powerful in my research is unconscious bias is a term that's used so prevalently that it almost loses its meaning. right? Or people stop connecting with what that actually means. The term I use a lot in my book is pattern matching. Pattern matching is this idea that people are constantly looking for patterns. It's a human instinct. There's no malice associated with it. But as a result of pattern matching, everyone of any background might miss out on opportunities. So for instance, investors say, okay, this is what I've seen a bunch of founders, startup founders that look like Mark Zuckerberg. And I'm just naturally trying to find a new Mark Zuckerberg. That's my pattern, and I'm trying to match it. I'm trying to invest in the next Mark Zuckerberg. So it's not malicious that they have this image in their mind of a young white guy with a hoodie who might have dropped out of Harvard. That's just natural human instinct. But I think it's really important to say, okay, it's not malicious. You're going to miss out on all these people who are phenomenal leaders and founders who look nothing like Mark Zuckerberg. But if you're stuck in that pattern, stuck in that rut, you're going to have a homogenous, vicious cycle that's just continuing over and over and over again. So you need to break out of that homogeneity. But we even see this pattern matching influence women. So for instance, I was talking to a female CEO, and she was saying she has a bunch of female managers, and she said, my female managers do invest more in, again, using data. They found that their female managers do invest more in mentoring, also invest more in diversity and inclusion programs. So that's something that is statistically borne out. But she said she was surprised to find that their female managers were even the women were paying the male employees more. And so equal pay is not something you could do by just like reminding people to pay equally. If female managers are so oblivious to their own biases that they were like accidentally having a widening pay gap, that indicates the fact that these things are very deeply rooted. Pattern matching, this idea like people who look like this are more likely to be managers, that's simply a pattern that has existed since the dawn of business. And now it's important for me to say, okay, what is this pattern that I'm falling prey to? Why would it be dumb for me just to keep perpetuating this pattern? But again, it's data that can counteract that. So I think shifting the conversation around from unconscious bias, this idea, well, we're just all prey to patterns. We're all have this instinct to try to match patterns. Let's move away from that. But I think companies need to sort of evolve their training and their practices and their embrace of data, whether it's hiring, retention, all of these things, data can help. And don't just assume that people have the best instinct, so therefore won't be colored by biases. Everyone has biases, whether they can realize it or not.
Really important. We have been here with Julia Boorstin. She's the author of a new book. It is When Women Lead. If you want to learn more about Julia and check out her body of work, go to juliaboorstin.com. And we look forward to seeing you next week. Same time, same channel, noon Eastern, 9 Pacific, on the internet. Julia, it is such a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much. I love your platform. I love that you have people tuning in from all over the world. It's awesome.
Thank you so much to everyone joining us, and thank you to Julia. We'll see you next week.